Hey, just while we're waiting the last minute before we start, I'd be grateful if you would share where you are in the world. So even just type it into the chat if you want, or if you're feeling extroverted, just unmute and verbalise. Whereabouts are you? Hey, Mel. Hey, Catherine. So you're in the UK, must be like 9 p.m, 10 p.m, something like that for you. Audrey, Chicago, Illinois. So it's like mid-afternoon for you, maybe 3, 4 p.m. Yara's in the UK. Janet's in Virginia. So you're Eastern time. So what are you, like 5 p.m, 4 p.m?
It's 4 o'clock, 4 p.m.
Audrey, you're in Chi-Town. Where's that?
Chicago. So it's 3 p.m. here.
Martha is in Mexico. Welcome. Louis in Ecuador. And I apologise if I mispronounce your name. Please correct me. All right. Well, it's hi, Abby. Kia ora. I'm in Melbourne, Australia. It's just gone 6 a.m. here, but I've been up for several hours already because that's how my body clock works. So it's so great to be here with all of you. I'm looking forward to this session where we're going to talk about anterior pelvic tilt. Is it a thing? And so I'm going to give you a little lecture which I've prepared, a few slides. I would love it if you would jump in with any questions, thoughts, anything you want to discuss as we go through, if you want to unpack anything further or something's not clear. And at the end also there is time for, I think I've kept it to a fairly small number of slides, so I'm pretty sure there'll be time for questions and discussion afterwards. But I would love it if just as things pop into your head as we go, or if I'm sharing something that either doesn't make sense or doesn't seem right or anything, please, I'd love it if you question me, challenge me, ask what might feel like stupid questions, but certainly aren't stupid questions because all questions are good questions. All right, so here we go. Pelvic tilt. Is anterior pelvic tilt a thing? So ambitiously set, I think 5 or 4 learning goals. Can't remember, but we'll know in a minute. Firstly, that pelvic tilt actually doesn't tell us anything about muscle balance, which is surprised the heck out of me when I learned it. Pelvises are not symmetrical. We can't measure pelvic tilt by hand even when we think we can. 80% of pain-free people have anterior pelvic tilt, and anterior pelvic tilt is not associated with low back pain. So those are learning goals. Now, when I was a kid, like metaphorically a kid, when I was a Pilates kid growing up in my Pilates certification, I was taught using these particular pictures, which are from a book by Kendall et al. Called Muscles, Testing and Function with Posture and Pain. And, you can see the ideal alignment here, and kyphotic lordotic posture, flat back posture, and sway back posture. Were you taught something? Was this sort of part of your curriculum when you learned certification? Can you give me a thumbs up or type it in yes or no or thumbs down? Yeah, all right. So this is literally just a copy out of the Kendall book. And when I did my Stop Pilates training, this was in 2004, so this may have changed since then. But the Stop Pilates manual that we got literally had photocopies from the Kendall book in the Stop Pilates manual. It was literally this image that we saw. So and I actually taught this for several years. I taught this to many students, many hundreds of students. I've taught them how to do posture analysis. All right, so, we were taught that there's this, figurative plumb line, which a plumb bob is a bit of string with a metal weight on the end that kind of builders use, carpenters use, and they use that because the gravity of the earth pulls the plumb bob, this thing, down and causes this to be perfectly straight. And so in my studio that I ran for a decade, we had several actual plumb lines that we would stand people up next to and measure, and we were supposed to have their front of their ankle bone, their anterior lateral malleolus, level with the plumb line, and then the middle of the knee, and then their greater trochanter of the hip, the acromion process in the shoulder, and the ear canal or the external auditory meatus. We were supposed to have all of those lined up with the plumb line for them to be ideal posture, but what we found was that not anybody had that, and everybody had some degree of deviation. I don't think I ever came across someone who had all of those body parts lined up with the plumb line. And even in the Kendall book, in fact, maybe some of you already observed this, but in the Kendall book, the photo that they have of ideal alignment, actually the person has their ear is forwards of the plumb line. So even when they were tried to find someone for the book to photograph them in ideal alignment, they actually couldn't find someone. All right, so that's what I learned. I think that's what a lot of you guys learned, but is it true? All right, so the first thing, and just particularly in relation to pelvic tilt, is that surprisingly it doesn't tell us anything about muscle balance. So when I was trained up, I was taught that with anterior pelvic tilt, that suggests that the person might have short and or strong hip flexors, weak and or long abs and butt and hamstrings, short and or strong lower back. Okay. And so that's what I was trained up. And then therefore, if someone had an anterior pelvic tilt, you would then go, okay, well, let's stretch their hip flexors and their lower back. Let's strengthen their lower abs and strengthen their glutes and hamstrings. Okay. And that would kind of form the basis of your program. And so, when I started reading on this a few years ago, what I found was that's not true. So in this experiment from 1987, the researchers got a bunch of people and measured their lordosis, the curvature of their low back, and their pelvic tilt, and then measured their abdominal strength and looked for, were those things correlated? And the answer was no, they weren't correlated. So some people who had very strong abdominals had anterior pelvic tilt. Some people who had very weak abdominals had anterior pelvic tilt. And so you could have strong or weak abdominals, and you could have anterior pelvic tilt or not, and those two things were just not related. You could have one or both or neither. And by the way, in this presentation, we will, if you're registered, which you are because that's how you get here. If you're registered for this on our list, we will send you an email. Carol will send you an email. That's Carol. Wave, Carol. Carol's awesome. She organises all of the things. So if anything ever works in relation to these presentations, that's Carol's doing. So Carol will send you an email with a link to the recording of this session. And also underneath the recording, when you go there, will be a PDF copy of these lecture notes. And the reason I'm telling you this long and seemingly irrelevant story is that every time there's a slide here and I'm saying, okay, here we're looking at, here's what they found. This is the study. Okay, so that's the name of the research paper, the name of the researchers, where it was published, all of that. And then this blue thing here, it's way too small for you to read on the screen now. But when you get the PDF notes, they're high resolution and you'll be able to read it fairly easily. You can zoom in, and it's actually a clickable link, and that will take you to the full text of this paper. So you can actually read the original research paper if you want to, by clicking through from the PDF notes that Carol will share with you under the video. So anyway, that's why there's all this little scribble at the bottom here. You don't need to read it as we go, but that's the research paper that where that information came from. All right, and this one, sometimes there's no little blue link here, and that's because this particular paper is from 2021, and I haven't been able to find the full text for it yet. So I don't have the full text for that, but most of them I do. So hip and spine flexibility and strength are not related to lumbar lordosis. So this was another similar study from 2021, though, where researchers basically got a whole bunch of people into the lab and measured their lumbar lordosis, their pelvic tilt, and then measured, their hip flexibility, their hip extension, their hip flexion, and also the strength of those muscles, and found, again, no correlation between how long or short or strong or weak those muscles were, and whether someone was standing in an anterior pelvic tilt or not. And when we do interventions designed to increase abdominal strength, we don't change pelvic tilt. So this is the starting position for the test of abdominal muscle strength. And if those of you who've read Kendall, Muscles, Testing and Function with Posture and Pain, or learned muscle testing at any point, will know that will recognise this as the starting position for the lower abdominal strength test. So, when I was learning and teaching this stuff, I would teach my clients to lie down flat with their legs straight up, flatten their low back against the mat or the bed or the Cadillac, whatever they were lying on. Usually I would stick my hand under their low back there and say, can you squash my hand as firmly as possible? And then I would ask them to lower their legs and keep pressing on my hand, and I'd see how low the legs can go whilst still pressing their low back firmly down to the mat. So that's the test of abdominal strength. And in this, and if you've done that test, you'll know it's actually an awesome low ab exercise, right? It's like the straight double leg stretch from the series of 5. So, except the hand position is different, and the head position is different. But for the lower abdominals, this is a fantastic exercise. So these people did 8 weeks of that exercise. Their abdominals got stronger, but it didn't change their pelvic tilt. Amy asks, how did they measure pelvic tilt? So often in these studies, they measure it by X-ray. Sometimes they measure it by using an inclinometer. So they put like a bubble thing from a spirit level type thing. They put it on their lumbar spine, or they might put one on the sacrum and one on the lumbar spine as measure the difference between those. And in the kind of not very good studies, they measure it by palpation, which is basically invalid, as we're going to find shortly. And Anna asks, is the reverse true? Is posterior pelvic tilt is also not related to muscle balance? And the answer to that is yes, that is also true. So basically pelvic tilt, posterior, anterior or neutral, doesn't relate to muscle balance. All right. When we stretch people's hamstrings for a period of 8 weeks, I think they did in this study in 1996, it increases their hamstring flexibility. So PSLR stands for passive straight leg raise, and that just is this position here where the leg is lifted not using the leg muscles. So either a therapist lifts the leg or the person lifts the leg themselves, like by pulling on a strap or, some other thing. And so basically the leg is relaxed and with the knee straight and you lift it up. That's the passive straight leg raise. So when you stretch your hamstrings for, weeks consistently, unsurprisingly, you increase your hip flexibility, but that doesn't change pelvic tilt. And now the next 2 slides are about really just thinking through this logically. So I've presented to you a few slides that talk about, okay, when we, correlate pelvic tilt with abdominal strength or hip flexor length or whatever it might be, we just see there's no correlation. But just the next two slides, I want to talk about just like thinking through it from a logical standpoint, okay? And so what this slide says is that when we are in just erect standing, so just normal standing, okay, your erector spinae, so those your lower back muscles, the gluteus maximus, your butt, and your hamstrings are basically completely inactive. Okay, so this was a study where they put electromyographs or EMGs on those muscles to measure the electrical activity in the muscles in different positions. And, so these here correlate to how much trunk flexion the person was in. Okay, so as you bend, this is the erector spinae here, and so as you bend further and further forward, the erector spinae get more and more active, but then as you get fully bent forward, they become inactive. Okay, the back muscles relax as you go into a full forward bend, but as you as you stand here and then bend a bit forward, and you can feel this yourself if you want. If you just put your hand on your low back muscles and then bend forwards a little bit, you'll feel the muscles become active. Okay, well, of course they do, because if they weren't active, you would flop like a rag doll and your head would hit your knees. So what this slide tells us is in this column here, in 0 degrees, okay, in upright standing, erector spinae essentially are working at like 5% of their full strength, a very, very, very small amount. Gluteus maximus, even less. Biceps femoris, which is one of the hamstrings, okay, virtually inactive. And so if those muscles are essentially inactive, right, they're just not on when you're standing, how would their strength influence your standing posture? Right? So if I've got super strong or super weak erector spinae, how is that going to influence my standing posture if my erector spinae are off when I'm standing? Does that make sense? So, so that's, to me, that was like, that kind of is like, because I always thought, if you have weak erector spinae, they'll allow the pelvis, if you have weak erector spinae, here's your pelvis, okay, here's your spine, here's your hip, there's your sacrum, here's your erector spinae, okay, here's your abdominals, okay, and I was always taught, the abdominals pull the pelvis up this way, the erector spinae pull the pelvis up this way, okay, they pull it that way, and the abdominals pull it that way. Okay, and so if the abdominals are stronger and the erector spinae are weaker, well, the pelvis will go that way, and vice versa if the erector spinae is stronger. But it turns out that in relaxed standing, those muscles are asleep. Okay, they're doing nothing. So it doesn't matter how strong they are. It's not a tug of war, it's just everybody's asleep. So, yeah. All right. Amy asked, what about if they're shortened? Is that a thing? Example, if the hip flexors are short and in relaxed standing, they're asleep, but if they're short, can they still pull? Amy, you have exactly anticipated my next slide. Great question. All right. Why? Well, not exactly, because you said hip flexors, but I'm going to show you hamstrings, but it's exactly the same principle. Why tight hamstrings do not limit your ability to stand in neutral. Now, when you look at my skeleton in a second, you're going to see, you might be a bit shocked at the poor state that it's in, but don't worry, no skeletons were harmed in the making of this presentation. All right, here's our skeleton. Here's the pelvis. There is the ischial tuberosity. That is the origin of the hamstring muscles. There is our hamstring muscle. It's not a real hamstring muscle. It's just made of duct tape. And there is our fibula and tibia, and that is the insertion of, the other end at the distal attachment of the hamstring muscle. So the hamstring muscles run from the ischial tuberosity of the pelvis to the shin bone and the other shin bone. And so when the hips, are roughly in neutral, neither flexed nor extended, okay, the hamstring is at its what we would call the resting length, okay, and then the hamstring shortens when you flex the knee and extend the hip, okay, and the hamstring lengthens, and I can't go too far because this isn't elastic and it'll just pull itself apart. But as you flex the hip and extend the knee, the hamstring is stretched, okay, lengthens. Thumbs up if you're following along, or if not, ask a question, please. All right. So this position here, roughly the neutral position of the hip, okay, neither flexed nor extended, and the neutral position of the knee, which is fully extended. Okay, so when we're in this position here, the hamstring is at its kind of mid-range, right? It's neither lengthened nor shortened particularly. And as we go this way, the hamstring shortens, okay? And as we go this way, the hamstring lengthens. All right, so this is the mid-range position of the hamstring. Now, if I can walk, okay, so just say our hamstring here was in a shortened position, to say like Amy suggested, and like I was taught when I was a kid, if the hamstrings are tight, they can pull the pelvis into a posterior pelvic tilt in this case, okay? But the principle is the same if we're talking about the hip flexors on the front. It's the exact same principle, just the other direction. So when I was a kid, I was taught that if the hamstrings are tight in standing, they will pull the back of the pelvis down towards the shin and they will create a posterior pelvic tilt. But, okay, if the hamstring is so short that in this mid-range position, it's going to actually pull on the pelvis, well, you certainly won't be able to, like here we are, the hamstring's fully stretched here. What happens if I flex my hip to take a step in walking? Oh, I just avulsed my hamstring off the ischial tuberosity, because if the hamstring was fully lengthened, fully stretched in this position, so stretched that it's actually pulling on the pelvis, well, how are you going to get into this position? How are you going to step? How are you going to, get out of a chair? And the answer is you're not. So if your hamstring is long enough to do that, okay, it can't be so short in this position that it's going to pull on the pelvis. And the same exact thing goes, we could just take this off and stick it on the front, and that could be rectus femoris, and we could do the exact same thing. It just not back to front. All right, tell me how you're going processing that. Give me some thoughts. Being an introvert myself, I respect all of you as introverts who just don't want to say anything. But I also value you extroverts, and I love it when you pipe in and just go, yeah, I reckon this, or this isn't making sense to me, or I disagree. All right, good. All right, thank you. Thank you all for your feedback and input. That helps me know what's making sense and what's not making sense for you, and what's challenging for you, and what's like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Okay. So, onwards and upwards. the other thing that we find, in fact, when we look at research is that, and this is again from a 2021 paper where I don't have access to the full text yet, is that when we measure hamstring stiffness, it just doesn't, and hip flexor stiffness, it doesn't correlate with pelvic tilt or lordosis. So, what we've just talked about in terms of just the logic of how that works, we do see that is borne out in research. All right, little self-test. Now, please indulge me in this. It's just some true-false questions, and there is absolutely no penalty if you get them wrong. This will not become part of your permanent record. Okay, but I'd really appreciate you answering just T or F or question mark for each question. All right, true or false? Pelvic tilt correlates with abdominal strength. And the correct answer is false. It does not. True or false? Pelvic tilt correlates with hamstring and lower back strength and flexibility. And the answer is F. What effect does 8 weeks of abdominal strengthening have on pelvic tilt? And the answer is it makes your abs stronger, but it doesn't have any effect on pelvic tilt. What effect does hamstring stretching have on pelvic tilt? And the answer is it makes your hamstrings more flexible, but doesn't affect pelvic tilt. There is a question from Louis. So what happens in pregnancy? The pelvis moves. Is it important to stretch the hamstrings and strengthen the glutes? The pelvis does move in pregnancy, and that is not because of muscle changes to muscle balance. It's because changes of the center of mass of the lumbopelvic area and the body as a whole, and the pelvis has to move to accommodate the fetus and the growing uterus. So it's a mechanical thing that basically the pelvis has to get out of the way of the fetus rather than a muscle balance thing. Like if you put a beach ball inside somebody's lower belly, their pelvis is going to change position. And stretching and strengthening for pregnant women is awesome, and I highly support it, but I don't think it's going to change their anterior pelvic tilt. All right. Pelvises are not symmetrical. So this study is an absolute gem, and if you only read one study of all of the ones that I've linked to in this paper, in this presentation, I recommend you read this one. In this study, they got let me see if I can bring it up on my screen here and show the original paper. This study is Priest et al. 2008. All right, so here is the study, Variation in Pelvic Morphology. Now, this is a fancy word that researchers use that literally just means shape. Okay, so variation in pelvic shape may prevent the identification of anterior pelvic tilt. And what they did was they got a bunch of pelvises from cadavers, dead people who donated their body to science, and they put them in a special jig. And what the jig did was it basically held the pelvises in a exact position where the ASIS and the symphysis pubis were vertically aligned, okay, which if you've read your Kendall, which seems like many of you have, that is the actual textbook definition of a neutral pelvis, is when the ASIS, the anterior superior iliac spine, and the symphysis pubis, the pubic bone, are lined up in the vertical plane. That is the definition of neutral. And the reason we don't palpate that is pretty obvious, because you don't want to go palpating people's pubic bone. And so instead of palpating those points, we palpate the ASIS and the PSIS. And we say if the PSIS and the ASIS are level, or the PSIS is slightly higher if you're a woman, that is neutral. Okay. So what they did was they lined up these pelvises. They had the left and the right halves of pelvises, from about 20 people, and they lined them up so the ASIS and the symphysis pubis were vertically aligned, and then they measured how high the PSIS was relative to the ASIS, and they measured how high the iliac crest was relative to the ischial tuberosity. And they measured the variation between people and also side to side in the same person. Okay, and what they found was 7 to 9 millimeters difference in the innominate size, left to right. So that's the size of the whole pelvis from iliac crest to ischial tuberosity. So there's a height of the whole pelvis, 7 to 9 millimeters. Like that is like up to almost half an inch difference, side to side. And this is normal. This was normal, right? This was the average. ASIS PISS angle up to 23 degrees difference. So that the angle between the ASIS and the PSIS, there was 23 degrees variation, pelvis to pelvis and side to side, in the relative height of the ASIS and the PSIS when the ASIS and the symphysis pubis are vertically lined up, right? So when you line up all the pelvises, so the ASIS and the symphysis pubis are lined up, the PSIS is all over the shop. It's up, it's down, it's all in all different places. 11 degrees difference ASIS PSIS angle left to right on the same pelvises, and no difference, this one was the biggest shock for me, no difference in the ASIS to PSIS angle between males and females. And when I was a kid in my original training, I was taught that when on a male, when the ASIS and the PSIS are level, that's neutral. Okay, but on a female, the PSIS can be 1 to 2 centimeters higher when the pelvis is in neutral. Did anyone else learn that same scenario? Not true. Someone just made it up. Don't know who, but someone just did. Because that's not how actual pelvises are shaped. There's no difference in the relative. There are differences in male and female pelvises, okay, but the relative height of the ASIS and the PSIS is the same between males and females. Just going to draw a little brain explosion emoji. All right. So here are some actual pelvises, and this isn't a royalty-free image. I sneakily downloaded this off the web. I think it's from the Anatomy in Motion folk. So just this is a great image. I love it. And so here are 3 human pelvises. There is the iliac crest. Well, you can pretty much easily see that their pelvises aren't all the same height. Okay, but the top of those first 2 pelvises, that's the iliac crest. There is the ASIS. Now you can see on this pelvis, there's the ASIS. Here's the ASIS on this pelvis, and here's the ASIS on that pelvis. Crazy. There is the PSIS, 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 PSIS. That's pretty much lined up. And there is the pubic symphysis. Okay. There's just a wild amount of variation in between the relative location of these bony landmarks on different people. So if I palpate, these 2 clients, okay, and I go, oh, this person's in an posterior tilt and this person's more neutral, it's like, yeah, no, actually this person just happens to have higher ASIS than this other person, right? That's just the shape of their bones. All right, quick self-test. True or false? Pelvises are symmetrical. The answer is heck no, they're not symmetrical. I mean, think about it, right? Look at my ears. This one's smaller. No, this one's, my screen's mirrored. This one's smaller, this one's bigger. Can you see that this one's bigger? Okay, look at my nose. It's kind of crooked, right? I know that when you look at your face in the mirror, you notice asymmetries, one eye's a bit higher, a bit lower, your spine's crooked. There's some, we all have asymmetries. When you go to buy shoes, you have one foot bigger than the other, right? Like, we all have these asymmetries. That's just, humans aren't constructed on a production line in a factory. We're organic systems, okay? We grow a bit wonky, like we're not perfectly symmetrical, any part of us. And so why would pelvises be any different? All right. Which bony landmarks vary in height between pelvises? And the answer is, yeah, pretty much they all do. Okay, think of a bony landmark and it varies in height between pelvises. PSIS, ASIS, symphysis pubis, iliac crest height. All right, if you measure one ASIS as higher than the other on a client, what does that tell you? Yeah, it pretty much tells you nothing, is the answer. All right, and shortly we're going to discover that it tells you probably even less than nothing. All right, even though we think we can, we can't accurately palpate bony landmarks. So palpate just means to explore by touch. So that's when you put your fingers on the person's ASIS and PSIS and go, is that higher or lower than the other? Okay, or sometimes you might use your thumbs on the PSIS or the ASIS and look at it. There are different ways of palpating, okay? And there have been several studies over the last 2 decades that have compared the results when experienced, usually it's physical therapists, physiotherapists, that they get to participate in these studies. So in a typical study, they might get, say, 20 physical therapists, and they'll get one client, and each physical therapist in turn will palpate the client, and they'll say, okay, physical therapist, can you show me the location of the ASIS? Can you show me the location of the L5 spinous process? They'll ask them to locate specific bony landmarks and put a little sticker or, pin or, whatever, draw a texture mark on the person's, skin or whatever to indicate exactly where they think that bony landmark is, okay? And what they find is when they have 20 physical therapists do this, they get 20 different answers as to where the ASIS is, where the PSIS is, and they vary by like 1 centimetre to 1.5 centimetres between therapists, right? Which is like 1/3 to a bit over 1/2 inch, which is quite significant, right? So if you're going, oh no, this side's higher, it's like, well, is it actually higher? Or are you just like not on the right spot, right? And the thing is, you can't tell the difference. That's the thing. So this in 2020, okay, these researchers, Alexander et al., did a systematic review called The Validity of Lumbopelvic Landmark Palpation by Manual Practitioners, a systematic review. And what they found was, quote, the use of lumbopelvic landmark palpation does not reach clinically acceptable levels of validity. These results accord with other reviews and suggest the necessity of a shift away from over-reliance on landmark palpation to align manual therapy with practice guidelines. Right? In other words, it doesn't work. All right, self-test. True or false? Humans can accurately palpate pelvic bony landmarks. The answer is false. All right, there is a question from Victoria which says, those pelvises are of different sizes. Isn't it normal to have different ASIS positions when compared? Yes, Victoria, great question. And if we just go back here, but even the relative height of these. So for instance, if we line up the PSIS here, okay, all the PSIS are lined up. Now the ASIS are very much not lined up, right? So by lining up the PSIS, we're eliminating the height difference, right? Because we're putting the PSIS all at the same position. But then the ASIS is at a very different level relative to the PSIS. Look at the difference in height, relative height. This one is this much, this one is this much, and this one is this much difference. So it's the relative height that we're measuring. Great question. All right. True or false? Guidelines recommend the use of manual palpation to locate bony landmarks. And the answer is false. All right, almost done. This was a study from 2011, and what the researchers did was they got a couple of hundred asymptomatic people, so pain-free people with no history of low back pain, okay, and they measured their pelvic tilt. And what they found was it was actually 75% of women and 85% of men, okay, had an anterior pelvic tilt. So just think about that for a sec. These people had anterior tilt, okay, and this one was the normal person. What's wrong with this picture? Okay, if 80% of people have it, maybe it's not, maybe that's what's normal, okay? Maybe these are the normal ones. Well, isn't that the definition of normal? It's like what the majority of people have. So maybe anterior pelvic tilt is actually normal. And these are pain-free people. All right, self-test. What percentage of pain-free people have anterior pelvic tilt? Anastas, I'm going to bookmark your question and discuss it after the presentation because I'm going to be finished in about 2 minutes. And I think it's a bigger question. Right, and the answer is 80%. All right, now this is talking about the association between low back pain and pelvic tilt. Actually, low back pain is associated with a flattened lumbar lordosis, or in other words, a posterior pelvic tilt. So this was a very large systematic review and meta-analysis from 2017 that looked at the association between low back pain and posture. And what they found was that people with low back pain, so they basically got, they reviewed a whole host of other studies that had looked at low back pain and posture. And so what they basically found was that when they look at two groups of people, a group of people with back pain and then a group of people who are the same age, same gender, same socioeconomic status, same, health history, etc., who don't have low back pain, okay, what they find is in the back pain group, more people have posterior pelvic tilt. So there's an association, which doesn't mean that one caused the other, but it does mean that they both are present at the same time. They correlate with each other. So what they found was that there's an association between low back pain and flattened lumbar lordosis. So not anterior pelvic tilt. In fact, anterior pelvic tilt was unrelated to low back pain, but posterior pelvic tilt was related to back pain. But when we do stuff to increase lordosis, so, to quote, correct posterior pelvic tilt, it doesn't change pain. Okay. So what is probably the case, okay, and I haven't included these slides because it's kind of beyond the scope of today's lecture, but it's probably the case that posterior pelvic tilt and back pain go together more likely because people who have back pain tense their abs to protect themselves, okay, and hence end up in a posterior pelvic tilt. And so it's more likely that the posterior pelvic tilt is a result of low back pain rather than a cause of low back pain. And the reason I say that is because we know from other experiments, which I haven't included in today's presentation, but if you DM me on social media or email me or whatever, happy to share those with you, that people who have low back pain, and you know this from your own experience, right? When you've had back pain or when you've seen clients with back pain, people with back pain are stiffer. They move more slowly. They move more carefully, okay? Like, if someone has back pain and they bend, they do it stiff, okay? And what makes people stiff is they co-contract their abdominals, okay? That's literally what makes your torso stiff, okay? And when you co-contract your abdominals, one of the things that happens is it pulls you into a posterior pelvic tilt, okay? So it's probably the case, although we don't know for certain because all the evidence is correlational, not causal, okay? It's probably the case that people with back pain have a posterior pelvic tilt because it's a part of the protective mechanism, just the reflex that we have to tense our muscles when we're in pain. Okay, so it's probably not the case that posterior pelvic tilt causes pain. And in fact, when we do stuff to correct the posterior pelvic tilt, it doesn't help pain any more than any other form of exercise, right? So correcting the posterior pelvic tilt isn't the solution for people with back pain. All right, self-test. True or false? Anterior pelvic tilt is associated with low back pain. And the answer is false. And Amy, good on you. You answered your own question. Well done. That's awesome. Is any pelvic alignment associated with low back pain? And the answer is yes. Posterior pelvic tilt is associated with low back pain. What happens to low back pain when we do exercises to correct posterior pelvic tilt? And the answer is not much. All right, so we said we were going to talk about the fact that pelvic tilt doesn't tell us anything about muscle balance because it just doesn't correlate, that pelvises are not symmetrical, that you can't measure pelvic tilt by hand even when we think we can, that 80% of pain-free people have anterior pelvic tilt, and that anterior pelvic tilt is not associated with low back pain. All right. I'd love to know your thoughts, your questions, your perplexities, your disagreements, your comments, builds, ruminations.
I have a question. I'm still not sold on the idea that the hamstring couldn't pull the pelvis out of position, because what if it's not just the hamstring? What if it's other muscles as well, in which case it wouldn't have to pull as hard if it was being pulled from the other side as well? Does that make sense?
So, for instance, if the gluteus maximus was involved as well.
Yeah, or the abdominals on the other side. Mm-hmm. Or not. Yes. Or the abdominals on the other side to pull into a posterior tilt. You could have some muscles pulling from one side and other muscles pulling from the other side. So each one would have to pull less than if it was just one, because this analysis was done based on just one.
Correct.
Like the hamstring you said would have to be at its max in order to pull it. But what if it didn't have to be at its max?
Okay. So, and that's a really great question. I love that you're thinking deeply about this, and this is causing me to think deeply about this as well. So that's an awesome question. Thank you, Amy. All right. So if I can find my mouse cursor, I can switch screens and then all will be good. There it is. All right. So maybe if I use this one.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So we already said that if you can flex your hip with your knee straight, okay, your hamstring is not maximally stretched here in this neutral position, okay?
Mm-hmm.
That goes the same for gluteus maximus. Okay, gluteus maximus runs from, well, let's test all of you. Can you type in or yell out the where gluteus maximus runs from and to? What's the origin and insertion of glute max? Do you know?
Isn't it up on the pelvis, up higher near the crest?
Anyone? Yep, it is near the pelvic crest. And where's the insertion? Where's
On
the other end of
femur,
it?
at the top of the femur.
Very nice. All right. So the gluteus maximus runs from the iliac crest, the posterior 1/3 of the iliac crest there, okay, and also from the sacrum. Okay, my tape's not big enough. And the vast majority of it actually inserts into the iliotibial band. About 80% of the fibers of glute max insert into the IT band, okay, and the sacral fibers, okay, so most of the iliac fibers, the lateral fibers, okay, they insert into the IT band, and these sacral fibers, the bottom fibers down here, they insert, about 20% of them, insert into the linea aspera, this rough line, okay, this rough line, linea aspera, linea means line and aspera means rough. So the rough line on the back of the femur here, that is the insertion of the sacral fibers of gluteus maximus. So the sacral fibers of gluteus maximus run from there to there, okay? And the iliac fibers run from here to the IT band, which then inserts into way down below the knee into the tibia. Oh, sorry, the fibula and the tibia and the femur and lots of other places. All right. So, but let's just, keep it nice and simple, and let's say that the glute max does that. Okay. Because that's, 20% of the fibers do that. Okay. Well, if the glute max is at maximum, tensioned, under tension here in this neutral position, well, I won't be able to flex my hip because the glute max has to lengthen to flex the hip. So if you can sit in a chair, the glute max has to lengthen, probably 100%. It has to double in length probably for you to sit in a chair at 90 degrees or 100 degrees of hip flexion. So if you can do that, which almost everyone can, okay, in this position here, the glute max can't be exerting any tension on the femur. It has to be in its mid-range. The same goes for the abs. The abs connect, so if we think about, say, the rectus abdominis, okay, it goes from your T5, the fifth rib and costal cartilage is about here, kind of mid-sternum, okay, and it goes down to your symphysis pubis, right? So if you put your two hands on those 2 points of your body, that's the length of your rectus abdominis, your six-pack muscle, okay? And when you contract it, it just pulls those 2 points together. So it pulls the symphysis pubis up, pulls your T5 down, okay? And that tends to flex your torso, flex your thoracic spine, and posteriorly tilt your pelvis, flex your lumbar spine, okay? And when you back bend, you pull those 2 points apart. So the symphysis pubis goes down and the rib cage goes up, and that, can you picture that lengthening out the rectus abdominis? Okay. So if I can back bend, okay, my rectus abdominis is not stretched when I'm standing straight, right? Because if it was stretched when I'm standing straight, I wouldn't be able to do that, right? So if I can do that, this is not the end range of my rectus abdominis. Okay. So if I can back bend, my abs aren't tight. if I can flex my hip with my knee bent or straight, my glutes aren't tight. And if I can flex my hip with my knee straight, my hamstrings aren't tight. So that, therefore, in that mid-range position, in base, roughly neutral spine, neutral hip, okay, straight knee, none of those muscles can be exerting much passive tension on the pelvis just because they're not stretched. That was such an awesome question. Right, there's an even more awesome, well, it's not even more awesome, it's an equally awesome question, okay, from Anestis, and it's a even bigger question, which is, in our posture assessments, as per the pelvis area, what are you suggesting we focus on? Right, so basically, if an hour ago you believed that pelvic tilt told you about muscle balance and back pain and all kinds of stuff, and if now you don't believe those things as strongly, well, what the heck do you do with your clients now when you're doing your posture assessment? And I would say, and this is, you might want to block your ears, don't do a posture assessment. I would say don't bother with that. I would say I would certainly do lots of assessments. I would test strength, right? If you want to know how strong their glutes are, test how strong their glutes are. If you want to know how strong their abs are, test how strong their abs are, right? So rather than using posture assessment as a tool to discover muscle balance, because it actually doesn't tell us about muscle balance, just test the muscles, right? How many squats can you do? How many curl-ups can you do? How many push-ups can you do? How many, whatevers can you do? Like, just test the movement, right? If you want to know about the flexibility of the spinal muscles, like, do a forward bend, right? How far can you do a backward bend? Do a twist. Measure their range of motion, measure their strength, all of these things. And that tells you about their functional capacity, and you're actually directly measuring things that are meaningful to people. It's like, if you want to be able to bend further forward, right? Well, let's see how far you can bend forward now, and then let's practice bending forward and see how much better you get. So that's what I would do. Penny says, so are you saying that anterior posterior pelvic tilt are due to how the bones are shaped and placed? Well, it depends how you measure it. I think when we look just in the studio, okay, when you look at someone, I'd say it's essentially what you're seeing is how big their butt is versus how flat their tummy is. Okay, and it's probably got nothing to do with their bone shape and just to do with where their body fat distribution and muscle distribution is, right? So it's basically what you're seeing is just totally an illusion. When you palpate, it's probably partly the fact that you're just not that good at picking up where the bones are, and partly the fact that bones are just not all in the same place where you expect them to be. And when we measure it by, say, X-ray or, MRI scan or something, which is accurate, then it is, yes, the fact that bones are not, symmetrical, and some people just have higher PSIS relative to their ASIS, even though their symphysis pubis and their ASIS are lined up. So I think that, is anterior pelvic tilt an actual thing? Yes. I mean, you can't see it on the camera, but, you can do it. You can poke your butt out, can't you? Like, anterior pelvic tilt is an actual thing, okay? But can we measure it when someone's just standing still and not especially trying to poke their butt out or tuck under? Yeah, probably not. And even if we could measure it, like if we use an MRI or an X-ray or whatever, does that tell us anything useful about which muscles we need to strengthen or stretch? Yeah, probably not. Does it tell us anything useful about whether they're likely to get back pain? Nah. Okay. So is it a real thing? Yes. Can we measure it usefully in the clinic? No. If we could measure it, would that be helpful in any way? No. So I'm just going to suggest it's not really, even though it is a real thing, it's probably not a meaningful or useful question to ask, what's this person's pelvis alignment? It's just not a useful question. Much better to ask, hey, I wonder how many curl-ups you can do, or I wonder if you can touch your toes, or I wonder if you can do the splits, or I wonder if you can do a back bend. Let's measure those things instead. Joanna, hey Joanna, great to see you. Joanna asks, why is cueing abdominal activation still a thing? That is a whole hour presentation. I'm sorry, I'm going to dodge that one because it is such a big question. It's an important question, but in the 0 minutes that I have remaining to present to you, I don't have time to answer that. I'm sorry. But thank you for asking it.
Thank you, Raph.
Thanks, Joe. And maybe that will be the topic of a future presentation. Amy asked, does this apply to the rest of the body? Rounded shoulders not related to tight pectorals? Yes, that is true. Amy, rounded shoulders are not related to tight pectorals. Now, I'm still a favour of I'm still a fan of pec stretching if it feels good. And if you want to increase your range of motion, it's a great thing to do, but it's probably not going to change your posture.
So could we generally, sorry, can I say one more thing?
Please.
Could you generally say to everyone out here that you should not select exercises based on a person's posture, which you analyzed visually or tactile?
Yeah, I would agree with that statement.
That's a big no-no.
Well, I don't know if I'd say it's a big no-no. I'd say it's not accurate, right? You're programming based on something that is not true.
Based on maybe aesthetics.
Right. So you might be strengthening someone's glutes or whatever, and maybe their glutes are perfectly strong already, right? Because you assume that their glutes are weak because they've got an anterior pelvic tilt. But why not just test their glute strength to see if you need to strengthen their glutes?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's great.
Thank you, everyone. And I really appreciate your questions. If you're watching the recording afterwards and you have a question, DM me on social media, and I would love to chat with you. All right. Enjoy the rest of your day, night. A special shout out to those of you logging in the wee hours. I appreciate you being here.